The point about violence is that you can really only be in praise of it when it's long ago. It's easy to say, heroics of 50 years ago, but when it was happening on the streets of Belfast or Newry, people took a very different view of it. And that put 1916 in a totally different perspective. I can't say it means particularly great emotional connection with it. I grew up and was educated in the north of Ireland, and even at school, although it was a Christian Brothers school, I don't think there was as much emphasis on Pádraig Pearse in 1916 in Newry as there would have been in Dublin or in the south generally. And at Queen's, where I studied history, it was a kind of contested issue, so we didn't go into it in all that much detail, as I suspect might have been done down here in what we then called the Free State. But when I came to Dublin in 1963, I joined the Labour Party subsequently, and I took a real interest in James Connolly, who I thought was in some ways the most realistic of the leaders. And I remember in 1966, at the time of the 50th anniversary, I gave a lecture in Newry on James Connolly. That was based on reading Labour and Irish history and Desmond Grieve's biography. But it went down well. Certainly one of those present, Nora Connolly O'Brien, James Connolly's daughter, thought it was very good. And I suppose it was because it was very much a picture, very favourable, a picture of Connolly. The other thing I remember, 1966, the actual commemoration struck me as being a very narrow kind of one. I don't think much account was taken of the North or the effects it might have on the North. And it also seemed to me that the leaders of the Rising were portrayed almost as canonized and untouchable, and that they weren't seen as ordinary human beings, but as martyrs who, in the Catholic sense, would have been sanctified. And that even at the time, struck me. It was, there was, as far as I remember, there was very little questioning of the orthodoxy that these were the great heroes of Ireland, and these had been the people who were responsible for Irish freedom. That was 50 years ago. Now, my memory may be false after all that time. I thought the commemorations were very well done. I think the committee, Maurice Manning's committee, deserves a lot of credit because there were a lot of potential pitfalls, and I think most of them were avoided. For the first time, I think there was a reasonable debate about the motives of the people involved, whether they were right or wrong. It was possible to express an unorthodox view. And the debate was by and large fairly civilised. The two books I liked were Roy Foster's Vivid Faces and Ruth Dudley Edwards' The Seven. And what you got from those two books was the expression that these were ordinary human beings with their faults and virtues. And they were, in fact, more interesting because they had obvious flaws, as we all do. And what I thought, after reading Ruth Dudley Edwards, I thought, actually what's surprising is that the seven, who were all such different people, were able actually to cooperate to the extent they did, because they were all very different people. Some of them were, I suppose, convinced figures that Tom Clark was the old Fenian and James Connolly was the socialist. The interest I had in Connolly was his attempt to try and reconcile republicanism or independence for Ireland with socialism, which was international creed, which I think he never really did. But by and large, I thought we had a more balanced view. We had escaped in some way from the straitjacket of orthodox republicanism, and we were allowed to look at them in a much more dispassionate sense. It has made no mark on my memory in 1991. You know, I think it was almost an embarrassment because of what was happening in the North. And that did change things I suppose it was the Northern Troubles that made everybody rethink. The point about violence is that you can really only be in praise of it when it's long ago. It's easy to say, you know, heroics of 50 years ago, but when it was happening on the streets of Belfast or Newry, people took a very different view of it. And that put 1916 in a totally different perspective. One of the first, I remember this was in the 60s, it may have been F.X. Martin who said first, said the number of people who fought against Britain in 1916 was as nothing compared with the thousands who fought for Britain in the First World War. And that, I remember that striking me, because the other thing I thought at the time was, in the 60s in Dublin, if you wore a poppy along the street, you could be insulted and called a British bastard or thing. So that whole conflict, and to be fair, particularly good on this was Kevin Myers, who was a former student of mine, but he did raise this whole issue of those who fought for Britain and how they'd almost been airbrushed out of history. They were given no recognition, and that's changed totally too. And I mean, possibly one of the great things is that the Battle of the Somme is being remembered on both sides of the border, and that the Irish people who lost their lives in that are being commemorated too. So I suppose these are developments that occur over time, but the biggest single influence was probably the Northern Trouble, because that brought to people, this is the reality of violence. You don't romanticize it. And even the 1916 thing, the numbers of civilians killed, that has given people pause. And then you're into the question of motivation and rectitude. And the other person who I think comes well out of 1916 is Owen McNeill, because I think the position he took is a defensible one, and people would sympathise with it. And that, in a way, he was betrayed by his own colleagues. So, I mean, that has certainly changed. So, I actually was very encouraged by the whole debate on 1916, and the fact that, you know, the people can legitimately hold contradictory views, and, you know, rightly so. I mean, nobody, I think, ever questioned that the courage and the commitment of those who led the rising. On the other hand, whether the violence was necessary to achieve what was achieved will remain debatable. I think on the day itself, all of the things that were over Dublin, particularly the possibilities of going, I mean, there weren't enough historians around. It was a bonanza for employment, but it actually, I think, connected with people in a way that hadn't, and people discovered things that they hadn't known, and the whole issue of what actually happened. Even Joe Duffy's book on the children who were killed and the number of civilians, and, you know, what happened to the various people involved and their motivations. I think all of that made 1916 a far more realistic, and people could say, well, look, there was the good and the bad in it, and, you know, we can, as it were, agree in some ways to disagree about this, and it is legitimate to have differing viewpoints.